Good evening, everybody. My name's Emma Cunliffe, and I have the honour of serving as the Principal of Green College here at UBC. And to begin our proceedings this evening in a good way, I would like to begin by acknowledging that we're gathered here today on the traditional, ancestral and unceded territories of the Musqueam people, whose traditional territories UBC Vancouver today occupies. It's important, I think, to begin any discussion about public health, precarity and uncertainty with an acknowledgement of the past and continuing effects of colonialism on the Indigenous people of Canada. It's my very great honour today to introduce this event. I won't be introducing Dr. Henry. I will leave that honour to Dr. Dev. But I will say a little bit about Green College and about the series of which tonight's event forms part. Green College, for those of you who haven't had the opportunity to visit us, is a college which is part of UBC, and we have two core mandates. The first is that we're an interdisciplinary academic programming space, which is intended to be a place on campus to bring people from across the community and across disciplines at UBC together to have conversations about some of the biggest challenges that face us in our world. In a research university, it's especially important to have a space which is dedicated to interdisciplinary conversation. The second aspect of Green College's work is that we provide a residence for graduate students, postdoctoral fellows, and visiting scholars, and we pride ourselves on being much more than just a res. Green College's motto, Ideas and Friendship, speaks to the values of intentional community that shape the time that our resident members have with us, and the values that we hope that they come in with and take back out into the world. This evening's event is part of our Leading Scholars series. The Green College Leading Scholars are early career academics who've been selected for academic excellence and an interest in interdisciplinarity. They complete a 2-year program. In the second year, they organise a speaker series as part of the Green College academic programming work. This year's Leading Scholars have chosen the theme of precarity and uncertainty for one of their speaker series. And when we and Assistant Principal Heather Muckart was talking to the scholars about precarity and uncertainty, it seemed clear, I think, to all of us, who better to come and speak about that theme than Dr. Henry. So I'm very pleased to introduce to you Dr. Dev, who is a faculty member here at UBC, and who'll tell you a little bit more about herself, I hope, as well as introduce Dr. Henry. But Dr. Henry, if I may say, we're honoured to have you tonight. Thank you for so generously accepting our invitation. We can't wait to hear what you say.
Thank you. Thank you, Emma. Good evening, all. So I would like to welcome you all in this series led by Green College Leading Scholars that includes me. So I'm Ruby Dev, Assistant Professor in the School of Nursing, and I'm also representing here my two other colleagues from the Leading Scholars, Dr. Joel Flynn Bloom he's also Assistant Professor in the Faculty of Pharmaceutical Sciences, and Dr. Ron Young, who is Assistant Professor in the UBC Sauder School of Business. Today I am here, more pleased, thrilled, and also a bit nervous to introduce one of the most prominent figures in the field of public health and health, who actually needs no introduction, but here I am, with the privilege to introduce Dr. Bonnie Henry, who is our Provincial Health Officer. Dr. Bonnie Henry was appointed as British Columbia's Provincial Health Officer in 2018, as BC's most senior public health official. Dr. Henry is responsible for monitoring the health of all British Columbians and undertaking measures for disease prevention and control and health protection. Most recently, Dr. Henry has led the province's response on the COVID-19 pandemic and drug overdose emergency. Dr. Henry's experience in public health preventive medicine, and global pandemics has extended throughout her career. She served in a number of senior roles at the BC Centre for Disease Control and Toronto Public Health, including as the operational lead in the response to the SARS outbreak in Toronto. She has worked internationally with the WHO, UNICEF, polio eradication program in Pakistan, and with the WHO to control the Ebola outbreak in Uganda, and has been actively involved in mass gathering health planning in Canada and internationally. Today, Dr. Henry will be sharing her insights from leading in a time of uncertainty and her road to kindness. Get ready to be inspired, challenged, and empowered to take action. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to the exceptional Dr. Bonnie Henry.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you very much. It's slightly terrifying to be here, but I'm very grateful for the invitation, and I do also want to, maybe I need to turn this down a little bit. Where's Dave? He's coming. All right, so as mentioned, my name is Bonnie Henry, and I serve as the Provincial Health Officer here in British Columbia. And I do want to start as well by acknowledging the gratitude that I have for being here on Musqueam territories. I've had the privilege of meeting and talking with several times Chief Wayne Sparrow and his family, and being welcomed into the Roundhouse, which is just down the way from here. And I think it is such a testament to the work that he's done and the community's done that we're able to gather together on these territories, and to acknowledge that part of the role that I have is to uphold the rights, the inherent rights of all First Nations, Inuit and Métis people in this province to health and wellness, and to do what we can to address some of those inequities. And I'll talk a little bit about that through my talk tonight, which won't be that long. So I thought with this theme of uncertainty and precarity, I would share some thoughts about my role and how I came to it, and what I have learned in my journey, particularly about leading in times of crises and uncertainty. And some of you may know that this is earlier this week on January 28th, it was actually 5 years since the anniversary of the very first media briefing that I did on COVID-19, and that it was a planned briefing that Minister Adrian Dix and I were planning to do, and over that weekend we had our very first case diagnosed here in British Columbia. And I think back on that, as I've had to this week, because I was asked about it a few times, and it really has been a long and a very hard journey for many of us. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that tonight, and about how do we come out of this better and stronger and more together in a time when we are facing, once again, uncertainty and precarity. So some of you may know that early on in this pandemic in 2020, I coined a phrase that became one of the phrases for the moment that we were in. Be kind, be calm, be safe. Especially in that very first year of struggling to understand what that moment required, as so much was changing so rapidly here and across the globe. So I want to talk a little bit about the story behind those words and how I've learned in my journey that words matter. Kind matters. Not just nice, Canadian niceness, but kind, from the root kin, that we are all connected, that we, being kind, recognizes that we don't always know another person's story, treating others with respect and care. Calm matters, and it comes a little bit from my own history, where people have told me that my being calm has helped them through a crisis. Part of that may be my voice is quite soft. Maybe I'll do sleep stories when this all ends. But it also recognizes that different people's reactions to change and fear and uncertainty cause some to lash out in anger and others to be paralyzed with anxiety. And being calm shows our compassion, our understanding that others are suffering in a crazy and uncertain time. And the word safe matters. Being safe means that we do our own bit in recognizing what's going on with others, and then that does our collective bit to get through the crises. So in preparing for this, as I said, brief talk, I was thinking about all we have come through in these past 5 years, and I'm struck by several things. First, acknowledging that we have all been affected by the global pandemic. Nobody has escaped the impacts. And I believe, as I mentioned, we're all products of our own experiences, but now we have experienced something collectively, something that has been life-altering, and we've all suffered in ways greater or smaller during this time. Where I come from, we have a saying that common suffering builds strong bonds, and I think we need to remember that. These last few years, which seemed like a lifetime sometimes, we have brought new challenges on a scale that few could have imagined in our lifetime, even me. And I've spent, as some people in this room know, several decades working on pandemics and trying to get people and governments to invest in pandemic preparedness. So a little bit about my background and why I come to this with the thoughts that I do and with the word kindness on my mind. So after medical school, not knowing exactly what I wanted to do, I joined the Navy because, that's what women did in the late 80s, early 90s. So I learned a lot. I learned a lot about myself, being in an environment where I was often the only woman in the room. I was a flight surgeon, I did diving medicine, I went to sea. I was the first woman posted to a ship on the west coast here. And oftentimes I was out there in the ocean with several other ships, all full of men, wondering, why am I doing this? What's going on here? But I learned a lot. I learned a lot about communal living. I learned a lot about leadership and how we depend on each other, communal dependence. And I took some of that to the work that I ended up doing once I got into public health. And I realized that the way that I thought about the world as a physician was much more than just one-on-one medicine, which is incredibly important, but being able to look at communities and populations and being able to do things and think about things that can help people. Privilege of working in other places, including places in northern Uganda on polio eradication, on working on other crises. And you come to realize that a crisis like this affects everybody in different ways. And I also understand, coming through SARS in 2003, we had a pandemic in 2009, an H1N1, an influenza pandemic. And in 2011, we had the very severe Ebola outbreaks in West Africa that were also spread around the globe. And it continues. As was mentioned, this virus is still with us, and it will be with us for this foreseeable future. And we've also seen through this crisis that the suffering was not equal. And I often think of Rachel Carson, some may know, who wrote a book called Silent Spring, and she talks about most of us walk unseeing through the world, unaware alike of the beauties, the wonders, and the tragic intensity of the lives being lived about us. COVID-19, this pandemic, exposed some of those long-standing inequities that we, in my world in public health, know only too well. We know that women, we know that Two-Spirit, LGBTQA, queer people, racialized communities, people living in poverty, disabled people, people who have are First Nations, Métis and Inuit, have suffered more. We know that. And we as a community, I believe, must not go back to unseeing. And I'm worried that we're taking those steps right now. We must continue to expose these inequities and consciously take action to address them. And I'll talk a little bit about that, even when it's hard. One of the other things that I've learned through this is acknowledging that making decisions as a leader in times of crises weighs heavily. And nobody can know that weight, despite everybody being a critic, unless they are in the position that you're in. And I learned some time ago through some of the crises that I've dealt with before, the importance of ethical decision-making and making that apparent to people. I had been working as the lead on a task group for the Canadian Pandemic Influenza Preparedness Document, and we had an ethicist, Dr. Carolina Alfieri from Montreal, who was part of our group, who I thought was incredibly important to help us think through what were the ethical questions that we would face in a time of crises like a pandemic. And early on, she called me up, we were talking, and she said, "Bonnie, your job is to do just enough." And I acknowledge, and it's challenging for me to accept, that you can never get it exactly right. And just enough will change as the crisis changes and evolves. We need to balance, and I needed to think every day about balancing the harms from SARS-CoV-2, the virus, and COVID, and the harms from the measures that we put in place to stop the virus, because these negatively impacted different groups. And we know that the disproportionate suffering from the virus was really on elders and seniors and people who were immune compromised from. But we also know that we had particularly negative impacts on youth. And I think a lot about you, about people 17 to 25, of the measures that we put in place, missing the ceremonies that are important markers of our lives. Spending the first year of university as a young person in my life did, sitting in a dorm room by yourself, not making those connections, not having that social interaction at that time that is so important in your life. And early on, the balance needed to tip towards saving lives, because we didn't have vaccines, we didn't have treatments. There was so much we didn't know about how this virus was spreading. And I think we are still understanding those risks right now and the impact, especially on young people. I also want to acknowledge, and certainly my experience has been, that there will always be chaos, unknowns, and uncertainty in an emergency. That's a given. Things will change, and sometimes really rapidly and sometimes more slowly, but we still must make decisions. Not making a decision also has consequences. And these are the challenges that we're faced as leaders in this system. Making decisions with imperfect information in a crisis is a critical skill. And it's one that not everybody is comfortable with. And I think that's important to recognize as well. And for me, it was a skill that we developed over time and from watching and learning from many others. Also, as a leader, making decisions and speaking to the public about them, I recognized, as I started off with, that words matter. What we say matters, and how we say it matters. And early on, very specifically, I used language that addressed ageism that we have in our society, valuing and respecting the lives of elders and seniors, who are the ones that were being most affected. Keepers of the knowledge, stories of our lives, our history. And for many Indigenous elders, they may be the last language speaker from their community. They are the keepers of language and ceremonies. So words matter. It matters that we use the right words to combat the othering that can happen in a crisis. And we saw that early on, particularly with anti-Asian racism. And there were some comments in the news early just this week talking about some of the issues in Richmond that people of Asian descent faced. We also know that Indigenous people suffered more from the long-standing impacts of colonialism, anti-Indigenous racism, and the entrenched white supremacist systems that we work in right now that confer unearned advantage to some and unearned disadvantage to others based on their race, based on how we look, where we're born, who we love, who we worship, what language we speak. Those things were very apparent to me and to all of us, I think, during this pandemic. But now that we have been exposed to this and we've been talking about it, we have, I believe, obligations to address these inequities in systemic ways. And in some cases here in BC, for example, we have legal obligations. We have UNDRIP, we have the DRIPA Act here in BC. So we need to pay attention, and we need, I think, we have a unique and important opportunity out of this generational crisis to really look at and dismantle the racism in our systems. And where we're doing that is in the public health and health system. And we have a lexicon that we use. We talk about colonial knots And untying these knots is part of the work that we need to do every day. Seeing them is really important. And to make this a more just society for all of us, and we can do that. We've seen that this true road to reconciliation does work when we pay attention to it and do it together. And some of the work that we're doing in my office has been driven by, we've been learning from the work of Dr. Kamara Jones, who's a Black scholar in the US, and Jody Wilson-Raybould. And she talks, and they both talk about learn about how racism is impacting your environment, understand its impact, and act to make change. And those are things that we can do now that we've seen what we've seen. Finally, I believe what we've witnessed in these last 5 years is what I call science in action. And I think that's amazing. You know, we've had tests, we discovered this new virus, we figured out how it was transmitted and who was getting affected, and we've had amazing new vaccines. They didn't come out of nowhere. They were built on decades of research into cancer vaccines. But this has been an incredible, in some ways miraculous, vaccine. And while this has been a source of optimism and hope for many of us, for others, this rapid advancement has been a source of confusion and fear. And I see that. I like to read physics sometimes, and there's a physicist, Carlo Rovelli. He was here in Canada for some time. He's now gone back to Italy. And he talks about science as the human adventure of accepting uncertainty, exploring ways of thinking about the world, and being ready to overturn any and all certainties we have possessed to this point. And he says, this is among the most beautiful of human adventures. But for some, this has led to embracing conspiracy theories and disinformation. And I've been looking a lot at, why do people believe in conspiracy theories? What does this come from? And it really comes from needing a sense of control, that the world is not so random, that this virus didn't just happen in nature. Conspiracies do, and for some people, help them make sense of a world by offering simple explanations to a very complex event. Oh, it was the Chinese, it was the scandemic. It just seems to make the world seem a more predictable place. But we know that people who believe in conspiracy theories, they can be associated with feelings of powerlessness, uncertainty, and that these fill this need for control and for blame. But as well, it has led to some of us being attacked and threatened because it makes people concerned about this. So we must remember that science is not static or absolute. Innovation and new thinking and new solutions come with challenge and come with change. Science in action requires us to learn as we go and to change our course and our advice as our knowledge grows. And it's not wrong. These are things that I hear from the politicians all the time. Well, you said this yesterday, and you're saying this, which is slightly different today. That's because we've learned more. And as we accumulate knowledge, we have to think about what does that mean for what we're doing today? And does it mean we need to do something differently tomorrow? And Maya Angelou says, do the best with what you know. And when you know better, do better. And I think that's something we need to try and take on. But I also know that for some people, this is very challenging. And this uncertainty leads to this fear and anger. And sometimes I think of the words of Taylor Swift, who talks about haters gonna hate, 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 hate. And sometimes you just gotta shake it off. So the work that I do and we do in public health also requires patience and persistence and perseverance. And we've learned that in spades over the last little while. Patience, I think we all know. But what's the difference between persistence and perseverance? So persistence is following a goal, continuing a task in spite of difficulties and trying to get to the end, achieving that. Perseverance is a little bit more about endurance. It's weathering the storm. It's overcoming those obstacles time and time again, even if it's not successful the first time. In my world, in public health, we're never alone. And we have seen this in our public health workers across this province, across the country. Never before has the work we do been appreciated this way, despite the critiques we've had to wade through. But I also know that, like everybody in healthcare, my colleagues, our teams, me, we're tired, and our public health teams are stretched to breaking, and it is relentless. It has not stopped. I believe and I worry sometimes that we're in the phase of trauma, of collective forgetting, and in some cases, which we've seen recently, rewriting of history. It is a way of dealing with such a massive trauma and disruption in our lives over such a period of time, a coping mechanism to forget the fear and the unrelenting uncertainty and the change that we've been forced to go through. But we are also still dealing with the aftermath of the pandemic, along with influenza and RSV and syphilis and high-path avian influenza and H5N1, the need to catch up on climate change, the catastrophic wildfires and flooding and drought, the toxic drug crisis, which continues and was worsened during this pandemic. And on top of that, we have inflation and housing instability and political instability. In the past, we've struggled along so well that we don't ever catch up or get a break. And we don't acknowledge how much we are stretched, and budgets get cut, and we lose those tools that helped us understand what was changing as we moved through these last 5 years. So I'm asking you, and my plea to you is, we cannot lose this opportunity to grow together, to remember our connectedness, the common bonds that we've built through the suffering that we've had, and to remember to lift each other up. So to end, some of the important things I have learned. Number one, never read the comments. Tell your mother never to read the comments. But with that is the very real concern that reasonable voices are being silenced from the hate, the echo chambers that thrive in some of our social media apps online. That's really concerning to me. That loss of civility, that inability to have a reasonable conversation with differing points of view. And we see manufactured outrage online that spills over into life. I believe, and I think there are many people who are starting work on this, that we need to develop digital media literacy, but also digital media citizenship. Address what we call pluralistic ignorance. Many people don't realize that others feel the same way they do when they're uncomfortable reading something online. There was a study done recently that showed that 9 of 10 children say that they would push back against transphobia and a few other things they were talking about online, but didn't know how, and they didn't know that others felt the same way, and they were afraid of being attacked themselves. So what we need to think about is, how do we teach empathy? How do we teach online empathy, especially to you and to young people? When we're online, algorithms don't have empathy, and they're not designed to help us have a meaningful conversation and connect with each other. We also need to teach efficacy, how to respond, how to address minor incidents. And I talk a lot about small daily acts of bravery. And it's those small daily acts of bravery saying, hey, that must have been really tough for you. Or standing up for somebody who gets cut off in the talk that they're doing at a meeting. These small acts of bravery build our confidence so that we can push back against the big ones when they happen. So we need to learn more about that. We need to teach people how to do this, to support each other online. Number 2, and what I've learned, is about scientific humility. There is no certainty about anything in our world, and that makes some people very uncomfortable. Humility and honesty demand that we be clear about the limitations of our knowledge. And this shouldn't be threatening, but it is for many people. We must not allow ignorance or not knowing to be replaced with dogma. And we're seeing some of that. We're seeing some of that particularly recently in our neighbors to the south. Along with that, though, I've learned that nuance leads to anxiety. But we still need to be nuanced. Everybody thinks that they're an epidemiologist now. I don't have to tell my mother what I do anymore. But when we present some of the more detailed things on during the pandemic, I remember the very first time we did a modeling presentation, and the minister was not very pleased. Oh, people won't understand it. It was like, no, we need to put this out there because people will get it over time. Nuance is important. And sometimes it gets, we want to dichotomize things and put it into black and white. It's this or it's that, and it stays, it's immutable. But it isn't. I also think we need to know that, not to confuse probability with imprecision. Two different concepts that we're using, but that's a nuance. And that's a nuance that we need to help people get comfortable with. Change leads to anxiety. And I learned that, absolutely. But we still need to make changes when the evidence changes. And we need to explain the changes over and over and over and over and over. And sometimes it's important to not make little changes repeatedly over time, but to save it all up. We do need periods of stability, and these were some of the things that during the pandemic where we made decisions to keep things in place, to give people a sense of calm and stability over time, and then make maybe one or two big changes altogether and talk about them in a reasonable way, build up to it. But it's challenging because all of us live with that degree of uncertainty, and not everybody is able to manage that as well as others. And for a university crowd, I think it's really important, especially for people who do really important research, that data and evidence never tells us what to do. It always has to be put in the context of values and preferences and judgments. What is it that defines the difference between, in the time of vaccine scarcity, do we give it to people 65 and older or 60 and older? Well, those are values and preferences and judgments, and looking at the population and looking at how much vaccine we have. And so we need as well to respect the roles of our elected officials. And that's a challenging thing to understand sometimes. We want to say, hey, my research says this. Why aren't you doing what I'm saying you should do? But we have to put it in those contexts. And in our democracy, the decisions are not only ours as researchers or as clinicians. It has to be put in those contexts with the people that we elect to help us make these decisions that affect our society. And I think that's something that we've held on to that's important in our world. We need to aim to find balance, and this is something, again, I say that's been hard for me, accept that you can never get it exactly right. And this was the things that we wrestled with daily over the last 5 years. And we need to err on the side of least harms, especially to those to whom we owe more. So First Nations, Inuit, Métis peoples, BIPOC communities. As above, this may also change over time. As we had vaccine, we needed to pay more attention to the harms that were happening to others. But acknowledge the harms on both sides, both from the virus, as I mentioned, and from the measures to control the virus. I learned to beware of humor. It's not always easy. And I learned something very special from one of the colleagues I work with, Danielle Bain-Smith, and she's Ochedene from Fort Nelson First Nation. Her father's a residential school survivor, and she's the Deputy Provincial Health Officer for Indigenous Health. And we were railing against something that was happening one day, and her father says, "My girl, our teachings are always to take the high road. It's peaceful up there. And if you meet somebody, you'll have a good conversation." So I take that to heart as well, because it's easy to lash out. It's hard when we're feeling attacked. But taking that high road is in the same vein as being kind. It's remembering that people are coming from their perspective and their background and their traumas. And there will always be those ready with the recriminations, class action lawsuits, and public inquiries. So as we are faced again with new challenges, I want you to think about the fact that we have gone through a collective trauma together, and we have that bond of understanding what it was like to go through that. We have all carried a heavy burden, and yet we have to persevere. There is uncertainty in our future. That is guaranteed. But we have new knowledge, we have new tools, and I believe we have a new understanding of the connections between us as a global community, that we can face these things, to find ways to use the bonds of common suffering to create a better path forward for us, a strong, resilient, anti-racist system that helps address some of these inequities that have been exposed. I think our aim, our goal, and what I'm looking for is, can we get to a place of what they call post-traumatic growth out of what we've been through, and respond to the relentless uncertainty with unrelenting kindness. Thank you. Merci. I